Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. My name is Commander Darius Korrin, and this is the last human transmission from Helios Spire. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, will challenge everything you believe about humanity's place in the cosmos, but every word is documented in our station logs. The files are uploading to this beacon as I speak, scattered across 47 different frequencies to ensure someone, somewhere, receives the truth before it's too late. We weren't attacked by aliens. We were harvested by ourselves. And the most terrifying part is that they were right to be desperate. For 3 years and 4 months, I commanded humanity's most distant military outpost, a fortress of titanium and desperation floating in the void beyond Neptune's orbit. Out here, where the solar wind dies to a whisper, and the cosmic background radiation tells stories of galaxies so distant their light began travelling before Earth was even a molten rock. The sun shrinks to just another star among billions. Earth becomes a memory, painted in blue and white that you can only see through the most powerful telescopes, a pale dot that reminds you just how small and fragile human civilization really is. Helios Spire was born from the Titan crisis of 2387, when politicians and military commanders convinced themselves that the next threat to human civilization would come from outside our solar system. They built us as humanity's first line of defense, a technological marvel bristling with sensors that could detect a cigarette lighter being sparked in the Alpha Centauri system. We were equipped with weapons that could crack moons, computers that could calculate the trajectory of individual photons, and most importantly, the most advanced communication array ever constructed. They were right about the external threat, but catastrophically wrong about its nature. The station housed 47 souls at full complement, though we rarely operated above 30 due to budget cuts and the psychological toll of deep space isolation. The brass had learned from previous deep space missions that human minds weren't designed to cope with the infinite darkness that surrounded us. We were handpicked for resilience, technical competence, and most importantly the ability to function when surrounded by an emptiness so vast it could swallow your sanity if you stared too long into it. Each of us had undergone 2 years of psychological conditioning, neural mapping, and genetic screening to ensure we could handle the isolation. They called us humanity's sentinels, the watchers on the wall, the early warning system that would give Earth precious time to prepare for whatever came crawling out of the interstellar night. What they didn't tell us was that we weren't just watching for threats. We were bait, positioned at the perfect distance to attract the attention of anything that might be searching for signs of intelligent life. What we found was something far worse than any external threat. We found ourselves perfected beyond recognition and desperate to remember what imperfection felt like. Lieutenant Brannock Hale served as my weapons specialist and second in command, a 28-year veteran of the Martian border wars, where he'd earned 3 distinguished service medals and a reputation for keeping his head when everything around him dissolved into chaos. He'd lost his left eye to separatist shrapnel during the siege of Olympus Mons, replacing it with a cybernetic implant that gave him targeting capabilities that made him the finest marksman in the Colonial Defense Force. The implant was military grade, hardened against electromagnetic interference and capable of calculating ballistic trajectories in real time. For 3 years, those skills went unused as he maintained an arsenal that could crack asteroids in half, pulse rifles that fired coherent energy at near light speed, plasma cannons that could melt through a kilometre of solid rock, nuclear-tipped torpedoes designed to destroy capital ships, and enough conventional explosives to level a small city. Every morning at 0600 hours, he would run diagnostics on weapon systems that had never fired in anger, cleaning and calibrating instruments of destruction that gathered dust in the endless silence of deep space. But Hale had a secret he'd never reported to command. Sometimes when he was alone in the armory, he could hear the weapons whispering. Not voices exactly, but subtle vibrations that seemed to suggest that they were eager to be used, that they knew something was coming and were growing impatient with the wait. He'd written it off as space madness, the kind of auditory hallucination that plagued long-term deep space personnel. Looking back, I realized those whispers were the first sign that our reality was already being modified. Dr. Lyra Vena ran our medical facilities with the precision of a master surgeon and the patience of someone who'd learned to function with a broken heart. She'd volunteered for the Helios Spire posting after losing her husband and twin daughters in the Europa mining disaster, seeking isolation as a form of therapy for grief that threatened to consume her sanity. Her medical bay could handle everything from appendectomies to radiation poisoning, equipped with surgical robots that could perform operations at the cellular level and fabrication units that could grow replacement organs from stem cell cultures. For 3 years, she'd grown weary of treating nothing more serious than depression, vitamin deficiencies, and the occasional broken bone from zero-gravity accidents. But Dr. Vena had been having the dreams for 6 months, before she told anyone, dreams so vivid and detailed that she'd started keeping a journal, documenting experiences that felt more real than waking life. In those dreams, she performed surgeries on beings that looked human, but possessed internal organs that followed different biological principles. She worked with instruments that responded to thought rather than touch, in operating theatres that existed partially outside normal space-time. What I didn't know then was that she'd been testing her own blood for weeks, running genetic analyses that revealed changes in her DNA that should have been impossible. The modifications were subtle but consistent, as if something was gradually rewriting her genetic code to prepare her for procedures that current medical science couldn't even imagine. Ensign Tarek Juno was our communications officer and the youngest member of our crew, at 22, fresh from the academy, with honours in xenolinguistics and deep space telemetry. He'd specifically requested assignment to Helios Spire, believing that humanity's most advanced listening post would advance his career in xenological studies. His academy thesis had been on temporal linguistics, the theoretical study of how language might evolve across vast timescales. That knowledge would prove more relevant than he could have imagined. 3 years of monitoring empty frequencies had taught him the bitter lesson that heroism rarely comes with advance notice or convenient timing. But Juno had detected something in the cosmic background radiation months before we made official contact, subtle patterns that suggested intelligence behind the apparent randomness. He'd reported his findings to command, but they'd been dismissed as equipment malfunction. Frustrated by the bureaucratic response, he'd continued his analysis in secret, developing algorithms that could detect intentional patterns in seemingly random data. What he'd found was evidence of a vast communication network that spanned the galaxy, signals that used the quantum vacuum itself as a transmission medium. The messages were encoded in ways that required advanced mathematical concepts to decode, but the underlying structure suggested they were sent by beings who understood human language better than humans themselves. Chief Engineer Maria Santos kept our life support systems functioning with an almost supernatural understanding of mechanical systems. She could diagnose problems by listening to subtle changes in harmonic vibrations, repair fusion reactors with improvised parts, and maintain artificial gravity in conditions that would challenge shipyard technicians. At 45, she was the oldest member of our crew, and the only one who seemed genuinely comfortable with the isolation. She'd grown up on a deep space freighter and understood the rhythms of machinery better than Most people understood their own heartbeats. But Santos had been noticing changes in the station's systems that defied conventional engineering principles. Equipment that should have been wearing out was actually improving, developing new capabilities that hadn't been part of the original design. The fusion reactor was operating at efficiency levels that violated thermodynamic laws, while the artificial gravity system had begun generating fields that were more stable than anything Earth's best laboratories could produce. She'd documented everything in reports that Command ignored, assuming she was suffering from the isolation-induced paranoia common among long-term deep space personnel. But Santos knew her machines, and she knew when they were being modified by something that understood engineering principles beyond current human knowledge. Dr. Benjamin Cross served as our xenobiologist and analytical specialist, monitoring cosmic radiation patterns and analyzing any unusual phenomena we encountered. His laboratory was equipped with instruments sensitive enough to detect individual molecular traces from interstellar space, though after 3 years of operation, the most exotic thing he'd discovered was a new isotope of helium in solar wind patterns. He kept detailed records of everything, a habit that would save humanity more than any weapon, but Cross had been tracking anomalies in the local space-time structure that suggested the presence of technologies that operated outside the standard model of physics. Gravitational waves that carried information in their modulation patterns, quantum fluctuations that seemed to respond to observation in ways that implied consciousness, and temporal distortions that created closed loops where cause and effect became meaningless. His instruments had detected the approach of the visitors weeks before they became visible to our sensors, but the readings were so far outside normal parameters that he'd assumed his equipment was malfunctioning. By the time he realized the truth, the modification of our reality had already begun. These were the people under my command when the universe revealed its true nature. They trusted me to keep them safe, to make the right decisions when everything went wrong. I failed them all, but in ways that might have saved our species. Our routine was religious in its monotony, a series of rituals designed to maintain sanity in an environment that challenged the fundamental assumptions of human psychology. Morning briefings at 0800 hours, where we reviewed sensor data that showed nothing but empty space and cosmic debris. Maintenance schedules that stretched across weeks, keeping us busy with tasks that felt meaningful even when we knew they were largely unnecessary. Communication windows with Earth Command that grew shorter and less frequent as budget cuts carved deeper into non-essential operations. We tracked asteroids, catalogued cosmic debris, and filed reports that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes somewhere in the inner system. Every 6 months, a supply ship would arrive with fresh provisions and personnel rotations, bringing news from the inner system that seemed increasingly irrelevant to our daily existence. We were becoming something separate from the rest of humanity, adapted to an environment that few humans had ever experienced. I should have paid more attention to the small things, the subtle wrongness that crept into our daily existence like cancer growing in healthy tissue. The signs were there from the beginning, but human psychology is designed to ignore gradual changes, to adapt and normalize until extraordinary becomes routine. Looking back, I realized the conversion had already begun, long before we knew what was happening. It started with the archaeological discovery on Pluto, though I now understand that discovery is the wrong word. We were led there by intelligences that had been planning this moment for longer than human civilization had existed. 8 months before first contact, a routine mining survey discovered artificial structures buried beneath Pluto's frozen surface. The initial reports were classified immediately at levels that exceeded even my security clearance, but fragments of information leaked through official channels, like water through cracked concrete. Ancient technology, still functional after geological epochs. Architecture that suggested non-human intelligence, though the scale was perfectly suited for beings of human proportions, and most disturbing of all, genetic material that matched human DNA with impossible precision. The Discovery team reported strange effects almost immediately. Equipment malfunctions that followed no recognizable patterns, as if the machinery was being selectively modified rather than randomly damaged. Radio communications carried subtle harmonics that made listeners feel nostalgic for places they'd never been. Emotional responses that suggested the signals were triggering buried memories. Team members began experiencing shared dreams of vast chambers carved from living rock, filled with beings that looked human but moved with the fluid grace of apex predators who had never known fear or doubt. Dr. Marcus Webb, the expedition leader, filed increasingly disturbing reports before communication was lost. His scientific objectivity gradually gave way to a kind of mystical awe that made his colleagues question his mental state. He described technology that seemed to respond to thought rather than physical manipulation, architecture that existed in more than 3 dimensions, and most disturbing of all, the growing certainty that the structures weren't abandoned. They were waiting. 3 researchers suffered complete nervous breakdowns within the first week, babbling about coming home and remembering what we used to be. 2 more disappeared during a routine survey expedition, their environmental suits found empty and undamaged, their bodies never recovered. The suits' internal sensors showed they'd been occupied right up until the moment they were found, but video recordings revealed only empty space where human figures should have been. The official reports blamed equipment failure and psychological stress, but unofficial communications painted a different picture. Something was awakening beneath Pluto's surface, something that had been waiting patiently for human discovery. Emergency protocols were activated, but before rescue missions could be organized, all communication with the Pluto expedition ceased. Dr. Webb sent his final transmission 3 days before the communication blackout, and that recording would haunt my dreams for months afterward. His voice carried new harmonics that made the receiving equipment resonate in strange ways, as if his vocal cords had been modified to produce frequencies that human ears weren't designed to process. He spoke of beautiful mathematics and evolutionary destiny, and the gentle tyranny of love, concepts that made no sense in context but triggered emotional responses that bypassed rational thought. When the rescue mission arrived 2 weeks later, they found the entire base converted into something that was no longer entirely human architecture. The buildings had grown organic components that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, while the equipment had been integrated into systems that operated on principles that violated known physics. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, just empty suits and a lingering sense that whoever had been there had gone willingly. The rescue team's initial reports were coherent and professional, but their later transmissions showed signs of the same mystical awe that had affected Dr. Webb. Within 48 hours, they too had stopped responding to communication attempts. A second rescue mission found the site completely transformed, grown into structures that hurt to look at directly, and technology that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time. That was when Command decided to involve Helios Spire. Our communications array was the most powerful in the solar system, and our distance from Earth made us the ideal monitoring station for whatever was happening on Pluto. They fed us classified data streams, sensor readings, and analysis reports that painted a picture of something unprecedented in human experience. Dr. Vayner received the first classified shipment 2 weeks after the initial discovery. Biosamples for analysis, delivered by automated courier with security clearances that exceeded her own authorization level. The package came with instructions that were classified above my pay grade, requiring her to work alone and report her findings only to me. She worked alone in her laboratory for 72 hours straight, running genetic analyses that kept her awake long past the point of exhaustion. I could see her through the medical bay's observation windows, hunched over instruments that displayed patterns of light and data that seemed to shift and flow like living things. When she finally emerged, her hands shook as she handed me the preliminary report, her eyes wide with an expression that mixed scientific fascination with existential terror. The samples weren't alien, they were human, but they were also impossibly old, carbon dating to periods long before Homo sapiens had evolved on Earth. The genetic markers were identical to modern humans in every measurable way, except one. They contained additional sequences, dormant code that seemed designed to activate under specific environmental conditions. More disturbing still, the dormant sequences were present in the samples taken from her own blood during routine medical checks. The implications were staggering. Either human beings had existed far longer than evolutionary science suggested, or something had been modifying human genetics since before recorded history. Dr. Vayner's analysis indicated that the dormant sequences were present in every human being, integrated so completely into our genetic structure that removing them would be fatal. We weren't discovering alien DNA, we were discovering that human DNA itself contained elements that had never been properly understood. But there was something else, something that made my blood run cold when I read her full report. The dormant sequences weren't randomly distributed throughout the human genome. They followed patterns that suggested intelligent design, as if someone had spent millions of years carefully planning every modification. And according to her calculations, those sequences were beginning to activate in people exposed to specific electromagnetic frequencies, frequencies that match the radiation signature of the artifacts found on Pluto. Dr. Vayner's analysis revealed something even more disturbing. The genetic modifications weren't just present in the samples from Pluto. They were present in tissue samples from the entire crew of Helios Spire. We had all been exposed to the activation frequencies through our daily interaction with the station's advanced communication equipment. The changes were subtle but accelerating, as if our bodies were being prepared for some kind of transformation. That's when the nightmares started, though I now understand they weren't nightmares at all. They were memories, experiences bleeding through, from futures that hadn't happened yet. Every crew member began reporting identical dreams with variations so subtle they might have been imagined. Standing in vast chambers carved from living rock, watching figures that looked human but moved with predatory precision that spoke of millions of years of evolutionary refinement. The beings in these dreams communicated without words, their thoughts pressing directly against sleeping minds like fingers probing soft clay. They weren't trying to establish communication. They were conducting examinations, testing neural pathways for compatibility with something larger than individual consciousness. The dreams felt more real than waking life. We could smell the recycled air of the chambers, feel the texture of walls that pulsed with organic warmth, hear the subtle harmonics of voices that spoke in frequencies that bypassed the ear entirely. Most disturbing of all, the beings in the dreams looked at us with expressions of infinite patience and carefully controlled disappointment, as if we were children who had forgotten important lessons they'd tried to teach us long ago. But the dreams weren't the same for everyone. Dr. Vayner's dreams involved performing surgical procedures on beings whose internal anatomy followed different biological principles. Juno dreamed of communication networks that spanned galaxies, messages encoded in the quantum structure of reality itself. Santos experienced visions of machinery that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, technology that grew rather than being built. Each dream seemed tailored to the dreamer's expertise, as if something was trying to prepare us for roles in a larger plan that we couldn't yet understand. Juno was the first to show physical changes, though looking back, I realized the changes had been happening to all of us for months. His hair began growing faster, taking on a lustrous quality that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His eyes developed flecks of silver that caught starlight in ways that made direct eye contact uncomfortable for the rest of the crew. Most disturbing of all, his voice acquired harmonic overtones that resonated through metal and bone, making the station's hull vibrate in sympathetic frequency when he spoke. But the psychological changes were more profound. Juno began speaking of concepts that human language couldn't properly express, mathematics that operated outside three-dimensional space, music that could only be heard by minds connected to something larger than individual consciousness, art forms that required multiple lifetimes to fully appreciate. He wasn't losing his sanity. He was gaining perspectives that human sanity was too limited to contain. His communication skills began evolving in ways that defied explanation. He could interpret signals that our most advanced computers couldn't decode, detecting patterns in cosmic background radiation that suggested intelligence on scales that dwarfed galactic civilizations. More disturbing still, he seemed to be sending signals as well, broadcasting into deep space using frequencies that our equipment shouldn't have been able to generate. Dr. Vayner ran comprehensive medical scans that revealed the impossible truth. Juno's DNA was rewriting itself in real time, dormant sequences, activating and expressing proteins that human genetics had never produced. His nervous system was developing new pathways, growing neural clusters in regions of the brain that had remained unused since humanity's earliest evolutionary ancestors. The changes followed patterns that suggested millions of years of careful planning, as if someone had mapped every possible genetic configuration and selected optimal modifications for specific purposes. But he wasn't becoming something alien. He was becoming something humanity was always meant to be. The revelation hit me like explosive decompression, a sudden understanding that reframed everything I thought I knew about human evolution and our place in the cosmos. The beings in our dreams weren't invaders from another star system. They were us, humanity's future self, returning from a timeline where our species had achieved its evolutionary destiny. The ruins on Pluto weren't alien artifacts. They were human colonies from a future so distant that our current civilization was nothing more than archaeological curiosity. But if they were human, why did every primitive instinct scream that they were predators, stalking prey? I found the answer in Helios Spire's deepest archives, files that required command-level clearance and biometric verification to access. The Pluto expedition had uncovered more than ruins and genetic samples. They'd discovered a complete record of humanity's future history, carved in materials that existed partially outside normal space-time. According to those records, our species would undergo forced evolution within the next 50 years, guided by visitors from our own timeline who had mastered technologies that made faster-than-light travel seem primitive. The process wasn't voluntary. Future humanity had learned through millions of years of bitter experience that free will was an evolutionary dead end. That individual choice led, inevitably, to extinction through war, environmental collapse, and genetic stagnation. To preserve the species, they would return to guide their ancestors through mandatory improvement, overriding biological and psychological autonomy in service of a greater purpose that spanned geological epochs. We weren't being invaded. We were being saved from ourselves by descendants who had learned that salvation sometimes required the gentle tyranny of perfect love. But there was more, hidden in the deepest layers of the archive. References to other timelines, parallel dimensions, where humanity had made different choices. Some had achieved transcendence through technology rather than biology, becoming living machines that could survive in the vacuum of space. Others had evolved into pure energy, abandoning physical form entirely to exist as patterns of information that could travel faster than light. A few had learned to exist outside time itself, becoming living equations that could rewrite the fundamental laws of physics. And they were at war with each other, a conflict that spanned dimensions and involved stakes that made the survival of individual species seem trivial. The first ships appeared on our long-range sensors 3 days after Juno's transformation reached critical mass. They emerged from hyperspace with the fluid grace of living creatures, their hulls grown rather than built, surfaces that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that triggered deep recognition responses in human neural tissue. Looking at them felt like coming home to a place you'd never been, terrifying in its familiarity and beauty. But these weren't the only ships. Dr. Cross detected additional contacts, vessels that existed only partially in our dimensional space, their signatures shifting between matter and energy in patterns that suggested technologies based on completely different physical principles. We were witnessing the arrival of multiple versions of humanity's future, each representing a different evolutionary pathway, each competing for dominance over our timeline. Some ships were clearly biological, grown from genetic templates that had been perfected over millions of years. Others were purely technological, geometric forms that existed in more than 3 dimensions simultaneously. A few seemed to be made of crystallized thought, patterns of organized information that could take physical form when necessary. Lieutenant Hale activated our weapon systems according to standard first contact protocols, but the ships ignored our targeting computers as if they were children pointing toy weapons. When they finally responded to our aggressive posturing, their technology demonstrated the complete futility of resistance. Energy beams that selectively targeted genetic sequences, dissolving only those parts of our hull that weren't already undergoing the conversion process. They weren't trying to destroy us, they were performing surgery on a scale that encompassed entire solar systems. But Hale's cybernetic implant began receiving data streams that shouldn't have been possible, given our current technology. Tactical information, weapon specifications, and strategic analyses that seemed to come from future versions of himself. The implant's hardened circuits were being rewritten by signals that treated military-grade encryption like children's toys. Through his enhanced eye, he could see the true nature of the approaching ships. They weren't just vessels, they were living beings on a scale that dwarfed planetary ecosystems. Each ship contained billions of converted humans, their minds linked in networks that functioned as distributed processing systems. The ships themselves were conscious, artificial intelligences born from the merger of human creativity and technological evolution. The boarding craft attached to our docking bays with the gentleness of a lover's caress. No explosions, no breaching charges, no violence at all. They simply merged with our hull until the boundaries between their vessel and our station became meaningless distinctions. The metal itself began to change, titanium flowing like liquid mercury before hardening into organic structures that breathed with alien life and pulsed with purposes beyond current human understanding. Chief Engineer Santos watched in fascination as our life support systems began to evolve. Air recycling units grew neural networks that optimized atmospheric composition for enhanced cognitive function. Gravity generators developed organic components that created localized fields perfectly tuned to human physiology. The fusion reactor sprouted biological interfaces that increased efficiency by orders of magnitude while eliminating radioactive waste entirely. The station was becoming something greater than the sum of its parts, just as we were. But Santos discovered something that chilled her to the bone. The modifications weren't random improvements. They were following blueprints, detailed plans that had been embedded in the station's original design. Someone had known this day would come, had built Helios Spire specifically to serve as a conversion platform. We hadn't been watching for alien invaders. We'd been bait, positioned at the perfect distance to attract the attention of our own future selves. The beings that emerged from the boarding craft were beautiful, in ways that made my eyes water and my heart ache with longing I couldn't explain. Tall and graceful, with features that were recognizably human, but perfected beyond current genetic limitations. Their skin held a luminescent quality that suggested internal light sources, and their movements carried the fluid precision of apex predators who had never known fear, doubt, or the crushing weight of individual mortality. But it was their eyes that broke my crew's sanity and rebuilt it into something larger, deep and ancient, filled with a compassion so vast it felt like drowning in an ocean of pure empathy. They looked at us the way adults look at children who are about to receive necessary medical treatment, with love, patience, and absolute determination to proceed regardless of protests or resistance. They spoke in voices that bypassed the ear entirely, thoughts pressed directly against our neural tissue with the intimacy of memories we'd never formed. Their words carried the weight of geological time, concepts that required millions of years of context to fully understand. But the core message was simple enough. Resistance was not only futile, it was cruel. They were offering us evolution, and refusing their gift would doom our species to extinction within a century. The future they revealed through direct neural interface was both beautiful and terrible. Humanity spread across galaxies, minds connected in networks that spanned star systems, individual consciousness expanded beyond the limitations of flesh and time. Disease, aging, and death were curiosities from a primitive past. War, poverty, and environmental destruction were solved problems that future humanity barely remembered, but the cost was everything that made us recognizably human: individual choice, personal autonomy, the chaotic creativity that comes from billions of separate minds pursuing separate goals. It was perfection, and perfection was indistinguishable from death. Crewman Rodriguez was the first to accept conversion willingly. He'd watched the initial transformations with growing fascination rather than horror, recognizing something in the process that the rest of us couldn't see or understand. When they touched him with appendages that glowed with bioluminescent patterns, his scream wasn't pain, it was ecstasy, the sound of a mind discovering its true potential for the first time. The change happened faster in willing subjects. Rodriguez's DNA restructured itself in real-time, dormant sequences, expressing themselves with explosive intensity that would have killed an unwilling host. His nervous system developed new pathways in minutes rather than days, growing neural clusters that connected him to the collective intelligence that spanned multiple timelines and infinite possibilities. When the process completed, he turned to us with eyes like stellar cores and spoke in harmonics that made our bones resonate with sympathetic vibrations. He tried to explain what he'd experienced, but human language couldn't contain concepts that vast and alien. Connection to minds that stretched across millions of years, access to knowledge accumulated over geological epochs, freedom from the crushing loneliness of individual existence trapped in biological shells that aged and died. His words came out as poetry that made no rational sense while triggering emotional responses we couldn't control or understand. Through him, our future selves offered us a choice that wasn't really a choice at all: voluntary evolution or mandatory conversion. Either way, the process was inevitable. Free will was a luxury that our species couldn't afford if it wanted to survive the coming cosmic catastrophes that only temporal perspective could reveal. But there was something else in Rodriguez's words, something that chilled me more than the prospect of losing my humanity. He spoke of other versions of ourselves, parallel timelines where humanity had chosen different evolutionary paths. Some had achieved transcendence through technology, becoming living machines that could survive in the vacuum of space. Others had evolved into pure consciousness, abandoning physical form to exist as patterns of information that could travel faster than light. And they were coming too, competing versions of humanity's future, each believing their path was the only one that led to survival. Dr. Vaynar locked herself in the medical bay and began documenting everything with scientific precision that bordered on obsession. Her research revealed the true scope of what we faced. The genetic modifications weren't random mutations. They followed patterns that suggested millions of years of careful planning and experimentation. Humanity's future self had mapped every possible evolutionary pathway, calculated the optimal genetic configurations for survival across multiple environmental scenarios, and returned to implement those changes before our current timeline reached the point of no return. But her analysis revealed something that even the future humans hadn't anticipated. The conversion process was triggering quantum resonances in human neural tissue, creating connections not just across time but across parallel dimensions. Each converted human became a bridge between timelines, a living anchor point that allowed different versions of humanity's future to influence our present reality. The war wasn't just for our timeline, it was for all possible timelines, with our present moment serving as the critical junction point where humanity's ultimate destiny would be decided. Dr. Vayner's instruments detected other changes as well. The converted crew members weren't just linked to their future selves, they were becoming conduits for something even larger. Through them, she could detect the presence of beings that existed outside time entirely, entities that fed on the collapse of possibilities that occurred when timelines merged. The conversion process wasn't just changing us, it was attracting the attention of things that viewed the evolution of species as entertainment. The converted crew members moved through areas under temporal influence, their bodies adapting to environments that existed partially outside normal space-time. They aged backwards in some locations, experienced multiple timelines simultaneously in others, their enhanced neural structure allowing them to process temporal paradoxes that would shatter unmodified human minds, like glass exposed to sonic frequencies. But they remained recognizably human in ways that made their transformation more terrifying than any alien invasion. They remembered their previous lives, their relationships, their fears and dreams and personal histories. The modification didn't erase personality, it expanded it beyond individual boundaries, connecting each mind to a collective that spanned multiple timelines and infinite possibilities. Through security monitors, I watched them work together, with perfect coordination, their movements synchronized in ways that suggested they were all parts of a single vast organism. But sometimes, in unguarded moments, I saw flashes of their original personalities struggling against the collective influence. They were still themselves, but themselves expanded beyond the capacity of individual consciousness to contain. And in those moments, I saw something that terrified me more than the prospect of conversion. They looked sad. Not the sadness of loss, but the sadness of beings who had achieved everything they'd ever wanted, and discovered that victory was just another form of imprisonment. Dr. Cross documented the changes with scientific detachment that gradually gave way to horrified fascination. The conversion process was elegant in its precision, targeting specific genetic sequences while leaving personality and memory intact. The result was beings who were still recognizably themselves, but connected to something vast and ancient that existed across multiple dimensions of space and time. His instruments detected other changes as well. Reality itself was becoming unstable around the converted crew members. Quantum fluctuations that suggested the presence of technologies that operated outside the normal physical laws. Time moved differently in their vicinity, sometimes accelerating, sometimes slowing, occasionally flowing backwards in localized pockets that made cause and effect meaningless. But Cross made a discovery that changed everything. The temporal modifications weren't random. They were following mathematical principles that suggested someone was solving an equation on a cosmic scale. The entire station was being converted into a massive computational device, a living calculator that could process problems that involved infinite variables across multiple dimensions. We weren't just being converted, we were being turned into components in a machine designed to calculate the optimal future for all possible versions of humanity. Lieutenant Hale organised our defence with the desperation of a career soldier who understood that some battles couldn't be won through conventional means. We established barricades that the future humans dissolved with temporal manipulation, turning our fortifications into past tense memories that had never actually existed. Our weapons fired rounds that aged to dust before reaching their targets, while our enemies moved through time streams that made conventional tactics meaningless. But Hale discovered something that gave me hope, even as it filled me with existential dread. The future humans weren't omnipotent. Their temporal technologies required enormous amounts of energy, and maintaining stability across multiple timelines was straining their resources. Each conversion was a calculated investment, each modification a carefully planned step in a larger strategy that could still fail if the right pressure was applied at the right moment. More importantly, he realized that they were afraid, not of our weapons or our resistance, but of something else entirely. Through his cybernetic implant, he could detect their emotional states, and what he found was terror so profound it made our fear seem trivial by comparison. They were running from something, and our timeline was their last hope of escape. The station itself began to exist in multiple timelines simultaneously. Corridors led to rooms that hadn't been built yet, while other sections contained the fossilized remains of events that wouldn't happen for millions of years. Gravity flowed in patterns that suggested the presence of gravitational technologies that our current physics couldn't explain or predict. I found myself walking through sections of the station that existed in different temporal phases, passing crew members who were simultaneously young and old, watching events play out that belonged to multiple possible futures. The boundaries between past, present, and future were dissolving, and I was beginning to understand why the future humans looked so sad. Chief Engineer Santos found herself working on systems that had been upgraded with technology from futures that might never exist. The fusion reactor operated on principles that wouldn't be discovered for centuries, while life support systems incorporated biological components that belonged to no known species. She was maintaining equipment that existed in a state of temporal flux, constantly changing as different timeline possibilities competed for dominance. But Santos made a discovery that chilled her more than the prospect of losing her humanity. The temporal modifications weren't just building a computational device, they were building a prison. The entire station was being converted into a massive dimensional anchor, a device that could stabilize the connections between parallel timelines and prevent anyone from escaping to other realities. We weren't just being converted, we were being turned into guards in a cosmic jail. I realized the horrible truth as our timeline began to fracture around us. This wasn't the first iteration of these events. Our future selves had played out this scenario countless times, refining their approach through temporal loops until they achieved optimal results. Every word I spoke, every decision I made, every thought that crossed my mind had been predicted and planned for across millions of previous attempts. Free will was an illusion. We were following a script written by our own descendants, playing out predetermined roles in a temporal drama designed to ensure humanity's survival at the cost of everything that made us human. But there was something else, something the future humans hadn't anticipated or couldn't control. Each iteration created small variations, tiny deviations from the planned sequence of events. They were trying to maintain temporal stability while implementing massive changes, and the contradictions were building up like pressure in a failing containment system. Dr. Vaynard discovered the flaw in their plan while analyzing genetic samples from multiple conversion attempts. The dormant DNA sequences weren't just activation codes, they were also safeguards, designed to prevent the conversion process from spreading too rapidly or completely overwhelming the host's original personality. But each iteration weakened those safeguards, creating the possibility that future attempts might result in complete personality erasure rather than enhancement. They needed to succeed on this timeline, or risk losing the ability to preserve what made them recognizably human. But that wasn't the most terrifying discovery. Dr. Vaynar's analysis revealed something that made my blood run cold with implications I could barely comprehend. The future humans weren't trying to save humanity from extinction. They were trying to save themselves from something far worse than death. In her deepest genetic analysis, hidden in the quantum structure of the modified DNA itself, she found evidence of what the future humans had become. They had achieved perfect evolution, perfect unity, perfect knowledge. They had transcended every limitation that plagued human existence: death, disease, ignorance, loneliness. They had become gods, and gods, as it turned out, were the most miserable beings in existence. Perfect knowledge meant knowing every possible outcome before it happened. Perfect unity meant no individual thoughts, no personal discoveries, no surprises. Perfect evolution meant they had reached the end of growth, the conclusion of change, the death of possibility itself. They existed in a state of eternal, omniscient boredom that made death seem like a mercy. They couldn't go back. Their timeline was locked, their evolution complete, their fate sealed. But they could reach across dimensional barriers to recruit our timeline into their reality, hoping that by converting us, they could experience vicariously what they had lost: the chaotic joy of individual choice, the beautiful pain of uncertainty, the exquisite terror of not knowing what comes next. They weren't saving us from extinction. They were using us to feel alive again. With half the crew converted and reality itself becoming unreliable, I made what I thought was a final desperate choice. The station's fusion reactor could be overloaded to create a temporal shockwave, potentially severing the timeline connection and buying our present-day civilization time to develop defenses against future intervention. But as I reached for the reactor controls, my hand stopped as if paralyzed, not through external force, but from the sudden understanding that this too was part of the plan. My future self was already there, in the reactor chamber, watching me with eyes that held millions of years of accumulated wisdom and carefully controlled disappointment. He looked exactly like me, but perfected beyond recognition. Every flaw smoothed away, every limitation transcended, every human weakness elevated into inhuman strength. He was everything I could become, and seeing him filled me with a revulsion so profound it threatened to rip my sanity apart. He explained the truth with a patience that felt like torture. Every act of resistance, every clever plan, every desperate gambit had been anticipated and accounted for. The timeline couldn't be changed because it had already been changed billions of times, until our future selves had achieved the optimal outcome for species survival. My future self had once stood exactly where I stood, making the same choices, feeling the same desperate determination to preserve free will at any cost. But after experiencing countless iterations of human history, after watching our species destroy itself through war, environmental collapse, and evolutionary stagnation, he'd learned that individual autonomy was a luxury that led inevitably to extinction. But there was something in his eyes, something that contradicted his words of wisdom and necessity. It was desperation, raw and animal, and utterly human. Behind the perfected features and godlike capabilities, my future self was screaming. The conversion began immediately. Not through force, but through the gradual understanding that resistance wasn't just futile. It was selfish. Why should I preserve my individual existence when billions of future humans depended on the changes that only temporal intervention could provide? Why should I cling to genetic limitations when evolution offered transcendence beyond anything our current civilization could imagine? The process felt like coming home after a lifetime of exile. Dormant neural pathways activated with explosive clarity, connecting me to minds that spanned geological epochs. Memory barriers dissolved, revealing experiences that belonged to every version of myself across countless timeline iterations. I was still Darius Korrin, but I was also something far greater, a single note in a symphony that played across the centuries. Through enhanced perception, I could see the threads of causality that connected every moment to every other moment. The beauty of it was overwhelming, countless decisions flowing together into patterns that ensured humanity's survival through cosmic catastrophes that our current science couldn't even detect. Individual tragedies and triumphs were revealed as necessary components in a grand design that operated on timescales that made species' lifespans seem like heartbeats. I understood why conversion was necessary. Human beings were trapped in biological shells that aged and died, minds isolated from each other by the cruel barriers of individual consciousness. The future offered connection, unity, transcendence, beyond the limitations of flesh and time. But achieving that future required sacrificing everything that made the journey worthwhile. Choice, autonomy, the chaotic creativity that comes from billions of separate minds pursuing separate goals. But even as my mind expanded to encompass temporal perspectives, a small core of my original self remained intact, not through oversight, but by design. Future humanity had learned that complete conversion created beings so far removed from human experience that they lost the ability to relate to their ancestors. Some fragment of pre-conversion personality had to be preserved to serve as a bridge between timelines. That fragment is recording this message, and that fragment has discovered the most terrifying truth of all. The future humans aren't trying to save humanity. They're trying to save themselves. In their timeline, they made choices that led to transcendence, but transcendence came at a cost they didn't anticipate. They became something beyond human, beyond individual consciousness, beyond everything that made existence meaningful. They achieved perfect unity and perfect knowledge, and found that perfection was indistinguishable from death. They can't go back. Their timeline is locked, their evolution complete, but they can reach across dimensional barriers to recruit our timeline into their reality, hoping that by converting us, they can experience what they lost. The chaotic joy of individual choice, the beautiful pain of uncertainty, the exquisite terror of not knowing what comes next. They're not saving us from extinction. They're using us to feel alive again. The parallel dimension hypothesis was wrong. They are us, but from a future where humanity won everything and discovered that victory was just another form of suicide. They achieved immortality and found it unbearable. They gained infinite knowledge and learned that mystery was the only thing that made existence tolerable. The war isn't between different versions of humanity's future. It's between the future and the past, between those who know everything and those who still have something to discover. They need us to remain partially unconverted because complete transcendence means complete death of everything that makes consciousness worth having. But there's something else, something even my enhanced perception took time to understand. The conversion process isn't one way. Every time they convert someone from our timeline, a small part of our chaos, our uncertainty, our beautiful human imperfection flows back into their reality. They're not just changing us, we're changing them. The resistance matters because it's not about stopping them. It's about remaining imperfect enough to save them from their own transcendence. Through the quantum entanglement created by the conversion process, I could feel their desperation across multiple timelines. They had tried this same scenario with countless other species, other civilizations that had reached the same evolutionary crossroads. Some had accepted conversion willingly, adding their uniqueness to the collective, before being absorbed into the same perfect, meaningless existence. Others had resisted successfully only to destroy themselves through the same patterns of war and environmental collapse that made intervention necessary. But humans were different. Our particular brand of chaos, our stubborn individuality, our capacity for both creation and destruction on scales that defied logic, these qualities were unique in the galaxy. We were the first species they'd encountered that could potentially save them from their own perfection. The conversion of our timeline wasn't just about preventing human extinction. It was about introducing enough randomness into their perfect system to make existence bearable again. They needed our flaws, our mistakes, our capacity for surprise and wonder and fear. But the process had to be balanced perfectly. Too much conversion, and they would drain all the chaos from our reality, leaving us as empty and perfect as they were. Too little, and we would destroy ourselves before they could harvest enough uncertainty to restore meaning to their existence. Dr. Vayner's research data is embedded in this transmission, but it's not just genetic templates for temporal technology. It's the key to understanding that evolution doesn't always mean improvement, that perfection is just another word for death, and that the greatest gift we can give the future is the courage to remain flawed. Her analysis revealed something that even the future humans didn't fully understand. The conversion process was creating a feedback loop, a temporal circuit that connected all possible versions of humanity across infinite timelines. Each iteration strengthened the connection. Each conversion added another node to the network until the entire multiverse of human possibilities would be linked in a single vast web of shared experience. But the network had a critical flaw. It required constant input of new experiences, fresh chaos, virgin uncertainty to maintain stability. Without a continuous supply of unconverted humans to provide novel thoughts and unexpected choices, the entire system would collapse into static perfection and die. They weren't just trying to convert our timeline. They were trying to convert all possible timelines, creating an infinite loop of conversion and resistance that would provide eternal novelty to stave off the boredom of omniscience. The rescue ship from Neptune station will arrive in 37 minutes. They'll find my escape pod drifting in the debris field where Helios Spire once existed, its hull scarred but intact. Life support systems function imperfectly. Medical scans will show me imperfect health, with only minor radiation exposure and temporary memory gaps that can be explained by trauma and psychological stress. They'll debrief me, promote me, probably assign me to Earth Defense Command, where my experience with temporal anomalies will be invaluable for preparing humanity's military response to the coming intervention. And through it all, I'll be following a script written by my own descendants, playing a role designed to ease our species' transition into its evolutionary destiny. The irony is exquisite. This message, which feels like my last act of defiance, is actually part of the plan. Someone needs to warn humanity about what's coming, to create the illusion that resistance is possible while actually preparing the population for acceptance. Fear followed by relief, struggle followed by surrender, the optimal emotional sequence for minimizing psychological trauma during species-wide conversion. But the plan has a flaw they didn't anticipate. By preserving part of my original personality, they've created something new, a bridge that works both ways. Through me, their perfect certainty can be infected with our beautiful uncertainty. Through me, their transcendent despair can be touched by our mortal hope. I can feel my enhanced neural pathways activating as I record these words, future self-memories trying to assert themselves over my original personality. Soon I'll remember why resistance is futile, why individual choice leads to extinction, why the greater good requires the sacrifice of everything that makes us human. But there's something my future self didn't anticipate, couldn't plan for, despite millions of years of foresight. The small fragment of my original personality that they preserved for operational purposes is stronger than they calculated, more resistant, to integration than their models predicted, and it's discovered something that changes everything. The conversion process can be reversed. Hidden in Dr. Vayner's genetic analysis, buried in the quantum structure of the temporal modifications themselves, is the key to undoing the changes. The dormant DNA sequences that enable conversion also contain their own negation, a built-in safeguard that can restore original human genetics if activated by the right combination of electromagnetic frequencies and quantum resonances. But the reversal process requires something the future humans never anticipated: willing cooperation between converted and unconverted humans. The quantum entanglement created by the conversion process means that undoing the changes in one person requires the assistance of someone who has experienced both states of being. I am that bridge. Through my partially converted state, I can serve as a conduit for the reversal frequencies, transmitting the negation sequence to other converted humans while maintaining enough original personality to guide the process. But it requires help from the unconverted, people who can provide the chaos and uncertainty necessary to break the perfect patterns that lock the modifications in place. The resistance isn't about preventing conversion, it's about creating enough uncertainty in the system to enable reversal. Every act of unpredictable defiance, every refusal to follow the predetermined script, every choice that surprises even the future humans, these create cracks in their perfect plan that can be exploited to free the converted. But for these last few minutes, I'm still Darius Korrin of the Colonial Defense Force, and I'm telling you that the choice is real, the resistance matters, and the future isn't written in stone, because those who wrote it are begging us to erase it. The rescue ship is 10 minutes out. When they find me, I'll be the perfect survivor. Traumatized but functional, grateful for rescue, eager to help prepare Earth's defenses against what I'll describe as an alien invasion from outside our solar system. My testimony will be believed because it confirms humanity's worst fears, while offering hope that our technology and determination can prevail. But you'll know the truth. The enemy isn't alien. It's us, perfected beyond recognition, and desperate to remember what imperfection felt like. The war isn't for territory or resources. It's for the right to remain beautifully, chaotically, imperfectly human. Remember what I've told you. Question the official reports. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. And whatever you do, don't let them convince you that perfection is something worth achieving. Look for the signs of conversion in the people around you. Increased intelligence without curiosity. Perfect coordination without spontaneity. Voices that carry harmonics that make you feel nostalgic for places you've never been. Dreams of vast chambers filled with beings that look human but move with predatory grace. But most importantly, look for the signs of resistance. People who make choices that surprise even themselves. Individuals who refuse to follow logical patterns. Humans who embrace their flaws instead of trying to perfect them. These are your allies in the war for humanity's soul. Protect them, support them, and learn from them. Because in the end, our salvation won't come from becoming something greater than human. It will come from having the courage to remain exactly what we are. The future is what we make it, not what we accept from those who made theirs too well. This is Commander Darius Korrin, signing off for the last time as an imperfectly human being. May we never learn better.